Peat cutters working in a Danish bog in May 1950 uncovered a face looking up at them from the dark earth. The man appeared to be sleeping. His features were intact: closed eyes, slightly parted lips, a short beard still visible on his chin. He wore a leather cap and a rope noose around his neck. Radiocarbon dating would later establish that he had been placed in the bog around 400 BC, more than 2,000 years before the workers found him. He is known as Tollund Man, and he is one of hundreds of human bodies recovered from the peat bogs of northern Europe since the 17th century, preserved by the specific chemistry of the waterlogged, oxygen-poor, acidic bog environment in a state of physical completeness that no burial practice achieves. Their skin is intact. Their fingerprints can be taken. The contents of their last meals are identifiable in their stomachs, and most of them show clear evidence of violent death: strangulation, throat cutting, stabbing, blunt force trauma to the skull. Who were these people? How did they die? And why were their bodies placed in bogs rather than given conventional burial? These questions have occupied archaeologists and forensic scientists for more than a century. Based on excavation records and forensic analysis, this is the story of the bog bodies. The discovery of human remains in peat bogs is not a rare event in northern Europe. Since systematic records began being kept in the 17th century, more than 1,000 bog bodies have been documented from sites across Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. The actual number recovered over the centuries is certainly higher. Many finds before the modern era were reburied, discarded, or handled without documentation when local people or peat workers encountered them and had no framework for understanding what they were. The typical discovery follows a pattern: workers cutting peat for fuel, a practice that continued in parts of Ireland and Scandinavia well into the 20th century, encounter something unexpected at depth. The initial reaction is frequently alarm. The bodies often look recent. The preservation is so complete that the first assumption is frequently that a recent murder victim has been buried in the bog. Police are called. Forensic investigation begins. And then the dating analysis reveals that the apparent murder victim has been dead for 2,000 years. The bodies that have received the most scientific attention: Tollund Man from Denmark, Grauball Man from Denmark, Lindo Man from England, Clonny Cavan Man, and Old Krogan Man from Ireland, were recovered in the mid to late 20th century, when forensic and archaeological techniques were sufficiently developed to extract detailed information from the remains. These individuals have been subjected to CT scanning, DNA analysis, isotopic analysis of teeth and bones, examination of stomach contents, and forensic reconstruction of their injuries, producing individual portraits of people who lived more than 2 millennia ago, of a detail that is available for almost no one else from their era. The preservation of bog bodies is a product of a specific set of chemical and physical conditions that occur together in peat bogs and almost nowhere else. Understanding why the bodies survive requires understanding what normally causes organic material to decompose, and what the bog environment does to interrupt each step of that process. Decomposition in ordinary soil is driven primarily by microbial activity. Bacteria and fungi break down organic compounds, with oxygen being an essential requirement for most of this process. Peat bogs are anaerobic. The waterlogged conditions exclude oxygen from the peat matrix, suppressing the aerobic bacteria that would normally decompose a body rapidly. This alone would slow decomposition significantly, but peat bogs add several additional preservation factors. The primary plant component of peat is sphagnum moss, a remarkable organism with several relevant properties. Sphagnum actively acidifies its environment by releasing hydrogen ions as it grows. A healthy sphagnum bog maintains a pH between 3.5 and 4.5, roughly comparable to tomato juice or wine vinegar. This extreme acidity inhibits most microbial activity, including the anaerobic bacteria that would decompose organic material in the absence of oxygen. Sphagnum also releases a polysaccharide called sphagnan, which binds to nitrogen-rich molecules in the surrounding water and makes them unavailable to the microorganisms that need them to grow. Tolland man was found on May 8, 1950, in a peat bog near the village of Tolland in the Jutland Peninsula of Denmark. The two brothers who found him while cutting peat were so struck by the lifelike appearance of the face that they stopped work and reported the discovery to the local police, believing they had found a recent murder victim. The police called archaeologists from Silkeborg Museum, who recognized the find for what it was. Radiocarbon dating subsequently established a date of approximately 400 BC, placing the man in the pre-Roman Iron Age. The initial examination revealed a man of approximately 40 years of age at death, with a well-preserved face showing the characteristic tanning effect of the bog. The skin darkened to a deep brown, the features compressed slightly but intact. He wore a pointed leather cap fastened under his chin, and a smooth leather belt around his waist. Nothing else. A braided leather rope was wound twice around his neck and knotted under his left ear. The cause of death was clear. He had been hanged. The stomach and intestinal contents, analyzed in detail, revealed his last meal with unusual precision. Approximately 12 to 24 hours before death, he had eaten a porridge made from a mixture of grains and seeds, barley, linseed, knotweed, bristlegrass, and more than a dozen other plant species. The mixture was not random. It was a deliberate combination of cultivated and wild plants, prepared as a gruel rather than bread. Some researchers have noted that this kind of mixed grain porridge is associated in Iron Age contexts with winter or early spring, when food stores were being exhausted and wild plants supplemented the remaining cultivated grain. If accurate, this would suggest that Tolland man died in late winter or early spring, at a time of potential food stress. The condition of his hands, well preserved and showing no signs of heavy manual labor, suggested to early researchers that he was not an ordinary farmer or laborer. His nails were trimmed. The skin of his palms was smooth. Whether this reflects his social status or simply the condition of his body after 2,000 years in the bog is a matter of ongoing discussion among researchers. The violence documented in bog body cases is not uniform in type or severity, but it is systematic enough to constitute a pattern rather than a collection of isolated incidents. The forensic analysis of the best preserved bodies has established a range of injury types that appear repeatedly across different individuals from different locations and time periods, suggesting a shared cultural practice rather than random acts of individual violence. Lindo man, recovered from a peat bog in Cheshire in northwest England in 1984, provides one of the most thoroughly documented cases of multiple method killing. Forensic analysis identified 3 distinct types of injury: a blow or blows to the top of the skull that cracked the bone, a ligature around the neck that had been tightened to the point of breaking the 3rd cervical vertebra, and a cut to the throat that severed the jugular vein. He had also been struck in the back. The combination of these injuries, interpreted by some forensic specialists as representing a ritualized triple death, has been linked by some researchers to descriptions in Celtic mythology of sacred killing that incorporated different elemental methods. Grauboll man, found in Denmark in 1952 and dated to approximately 400 BC, had his throat cut from ear to ear with a single deep slash that completely severed the major vessels. The wound is precisely placed and executed with a single confident movement. Not the irregular marks of a struggle, but the cut of someone who knew what they were doing and did it deliberately. He had also suffered a broken leg, though whether this occurred before or after death is debated. The pattern of injuries across multiple bog bodies, deliberate, often multiple, executed with apparent expertise, is consistent with killing performed as a formal act rather than as a crime of passion or casual execution. The bodies were not hidden. They were placed in the bog, sometimes with their eyes or mouths closed, sometimes with small personal objects nearby, in positions that suggest some degree of care. The disposal. To understand why the bog was chosen as the final resting place of these individuals, it helps to understand what bogs meant to the Iron Age communities of Northern Europe. These were not simply inconvenient, swampy areas to be drained and cultivated. They were liminal spaces, places that existed between the defined world of human settlement and agriculture and something else, something older and less controllable. They produced food in the form of birds, fish, and edible plants. They swallowed things that fell into them and preserved them. They generated strange lights, the phosphorescent glow of decomposing organic material known as will-o'-the-wisps, and strange sounds. They were places where the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond it was understood to be permeable. Anthropologist P.V. Glob, whose 1969 book The Bog People remains a foundational text in the study of bog bodies, proposed that many of the bog killings were sacrificial offerings to a fertility goddess, the earth deity that Iron Age communities of Northern Europe believed controlled the success of harvests and the continuation of the community. Glob connected the timing of deaths, the dietary evidence suggesting late winter starvation conditions, and the selection of apparently high-status individuals as victims to a ritual framework in which the most valuable thing a community could offer to the powers that controlled their survival was a person of significance. One of the persistent debates in bog body research concerns the social status of the victims. Were these individuals chosen for death because they were the most valuable members of the community? Kings, priests, or ritual specialists whose sacrifice carried the most weight, with the divine powers being appeased? Or were they the opposite? Criminals, traitors, or social outcasts whose violent death served a punitive or purifying function for the community? The physical evidence provides some clues, but not definitive answers. Several bog bodies show signs of high-status maintenance during their lifetimes. The hands of Tolland Man, Lindo Man, and several Irish bog bodies show no signs of sustained manual labour. The palms are smooth, the fingernails maintained. This is consistent with a life that involved less physical work than farming or craft production, which could mean social privilege, though it could also reflect the effects of preservation conditions. Isotopic analysis of teeth and bones from several bodies indicates diets higher in animal protein than would be expected for ordinary farmers, again consistent with higher social status. Old Krogan Man, recovered from an Irish bog in 2003 and dated to approximately 400 BC, was physically striking. Estimated at nearly 2 meters tall, with well-maintained hands and high-status grave goods, including a woven leather armband with decorative metalwork. He had been subjected to multiple injuries. His nipples had been cut, his arms had been pierced and threaded with hazel rods, and his body had been cut in half at the waist. The nipple mutilation is specific. In early Irish royal tradition, sucking a king's nipples was a gesture of submission, and cutting them was understood to symbolically disqualify a man from kingship. Some Irish archaeologists have suggested that Old Krogan Man may have been a failed or deposed king, killed in a ritual that simultaneously terminated his royal status and offered him to the powers of the bog. The criminal hypothesis draws on the Roman writer Tacitus, whose 1st-century account of Germanic peoples describes the drowning in bogs of cowards, deserters, and those guilty of dishonorable acts. Tacitus is not a neutral or fully reliable source. His account reflects Roman values as much as Germanic reality. But the consistency between his description and the archaeological evidence of bog killings has kept this interpretation in the scholarly conversation. Lindo Man, officially designated Lindo II in the British Museum's catalogue, because fragmentary remains found at the same site at different times have been designated Lindo I, III, and IV, was found in August 1984 at Lindo Moss in Cheshire, England, by a peat cutting machine that partially destroyed the upper body before the find was recognised. The surviving lower body and head, along with fragments from the upper torso, are among the most intensively studied human remains. British archaeology. Radiocarbon dating initially produced a wide range, with different samples from the body giving dates spanning from roughly 300 BC to 100 AD. More recent analysis has focused on dates around 300 BC, placing him in the late Iron Age of Britain, a period when Celtic-speaking cultures dominated most of the island. The physical description that emerged from forensic analysis was of a man in his mid to late 20s, approximately 168 centimeters tall, with a short beard and a moustache that had been trimmed shortly before death. His stomach contents included a small amount of burnt bread, possibly deliberately consumed as part of a ritual. The connection to Druidic practice that some researchers have proposed draws on classical descriptions of Celtic religious specialists and their role in organizing sacrificial rituals. The Roman writer Julius Caesar, who fought against Celtic Gauls in the 1st century BC, described Druids as conducting human sacrifices, though his accounts were written by an enemy seeking to justify Roman conquest and should be treated with appropriate skepticism. The association between Lindo Man's triple death injuries and mythological themes in early medieval Irish and Welsh literature has been developed most fully by archaeologist Anne Ross and historian Don Robbins, whose interpretation was controversial when published and remains debated. What is not debated is the care with which Lindo Man was killed. The sequence of injuries, blows to the head, strangulation, throat cutting, was executed by someone who knew what they were doing, in a specific order, without the marks of struggle that a resisting victim would produce. Lindo Man does not appear to have fought back. The analytical toolkit applied to bog bodies in the 21st century has transformed what can be known about these individuals without new excavations. The bodies already held in museum collections, Tolland Man, Grauboll Man, Lindo Man, and others, have been subjected to techniques that did not exist when they were first studied, extracting information that the original investigators could not have accessed. CT scanning and MRI imaging have allowed researchers to examine the internal structure of bog bodies without disturbing the physical remains, identifying healed injuries that occurred years before death, internal organ preservation, and the precise geometry of fatal injuries. Grauboll Man's CT scan, conducted by researchers at Aarhus University Hospital, revealed that he had suffered from arthritis and had a broken leg that had healed before his death, providing biographical detail that extends beyond the circumstances of his killing. Isotopic analysis of teeth and hair has contributed geographic and dietary information. Strontium and oxygen isotopes in dental enamel reflect the geology and climate of the area where a person grew up, allowing researchers to determine whether an individual was local or had traveled from elsewhere. Lead isotopes can indicate exposure to metalworking environments. Nitrogen and carbon isotopes in collagen reflect dietary patterns over the years before death. This analysis has confirmed high-protein diets for several high-status individuals and has identified at least one Irish bog body as having grown up in a different region from where he was killed. Ancient DNA analysis has been successfully extracted from some bog bodies, despite the challenging preservation conditions. The acidic environment that preserves soft tissue simultaneously damages DNA, making extraction difficult. Where successful, DNA analysis has provided genetic ancestry information, and in some cases has identified living relatives, though the implications of such identifications for questions of cultural heritage and repatriation are complex. The bog bodies collectively represent something unusual in archaeology: direct physical evidence of how a society managed its most extreme social acts. Execution, sacrifice, punishment, and ritual killing leave traces in the historical and legal record of literate civilizations. But for pre-literate Iron Age societies in Northern Europe, the bog bodies are among the closest thing to a record of these practices that survives. What they reveal is a society in which the boundary between religious and legal killing was not clearly drawn. The Roman writer Tacitus distinguished between execution for crimes and sacrifice to the gods. But the physical evidence from the bog bodies suggests that in practice these categories may have overlapped, that the killing of a criminal or a traitor could simultaneously serve as an offering to the powers of the bog, and that the death of a sacrificial victim could also function as a demonstration of the community's power to take the life of even its highest status members when the situation required it. The dietary evidence from several bodies points to a specific ritual context: the consumption of a particular kind of food before death. The mixed grain porridge found in Tolland man's stomach and similar porridge or gruel contents found in other bog bodies has been interpreted by some researchers as a ritual meal, the last food deliberately given to a victim before sacrifice, prepared according to specific requirements that made it appropriate for the occasion. If this interpretation is correct, it implies that the killings were not impulsive, but planned, with a ritual sequence that included feeding the victim in a particular way before death. The careful placement of bodies in the bog, positioned rather than simply dumped, sometimes with personal possessions, sometimes with eyes or mouths closed, also suggests that the people who placed them there maintained a relationship with the deceased even after death. The bog was not a place of disposal in the modern sense, but a place of transition, where the boundary between the living world and whatever came after was managed with care. The bog bodies are among the most humanizing objects in all of archaeology. The pyramids and the stone temples and the massive earthworks of the ancient world speak of collective effort, of social organization, of the ambitions of civilizations. The bog bodies speak of individual people. A specific man in his 40s who ate porridge and died with his eyes closed in a Danish bog 2,500 years ago, whose face is still recognizable as a face, whose last meal can still be identified in his stomach. That specificity creates an ethical dimension that most archaeological material does not have. The bog bodies are not abstract cultural heritage, they are people. Their preservation has been treated differently by different institutions. The Danish National Museum displays Tolland man's original head alongside a reconstructed body. The British Museum holds Lindo man in a climate-controlled case. Some Irish bog bodies were initially reburied after discovery because of ongoing debates about how remains of this kind should be treated in relation to the living communities that consider themselves descendants of the cultures that produced them. The scientific value of the bog bodies is not exhausted. New analytical techniques continue to be developed, and each improvement in isotopic analysis, DNA extraction, or imaging technology can be applied to bodies that have already been recovered, extracting information that was not accessible when they were first studied. The archive of preserved human remains in European museum collections represents a research resource whose full potential has not yet been realized.